Mm-hmm. I think it's already over. The era of the newspaper, we're locked in this constant conversation about how to rescue the newspaper, how to save the newspaper. I feel like that fight is lost, with a couple of notable exceptions. In Canada, because the Globe and Mail has a billionaire family backing it, they're still able to more or less serve the function they've always served. And in the States, there's some outliers. The New York Times still is resourced to do great work, but especially on a local level, I fear that the fight has been lost, and we're locked in this kind of perpetual period of the zombie newspaper, where these hollowed out newspapers, a lot of them have been snapped up into large consolidated chains. So you still sort of feel like maybe you've got a newspaper. Something comes out that has a masthead, or you can go to the website and it still looks like your local newspaper, but there's hardly anybody working there anymore. And you might have one reporter, if that, who is not necessarily able to go to the legislature. What we call the shoe leather reporting of keeping government responsible, holding their feet to the fire, happens sporadically. What you're mostly seeing are wire service stories and advertisements, and it's being propped up by subsidies from government and from technology companies. And in the case of the National Post here in Canada, there isn't even a newsroom anymore. So wherever we are going to get that kind of basic local journalism, I was all on board to try to find a way to save the newspaper. I'm not sure it's possible. Sure. Got it. 10 years ago, the media establishment of Canada seemed like a really powerful thing. And the point of Canadaland was, oh, we need journalism about journalists, because these legacy news organizations are still so influential that, just as in the States they have On the Media, which is an NPR show that does a great job of doing journalism about journalists, so too did Canada need somebody to do journalism about journalists. What has become difficult in the 10 years since Canadaland started, and it's grown and grown, is that to focus exclusively on scrutinizing the legacy media is to be focused on something that barely exists anymore, and is still a relevant part of our national conversation, but is just one piece of the pie of where people are getting their information from. And it becomes too narrow a focus. And to the extent that we're critical, it does feel like you are kicking a dead horse, because it has been so hollowed out. It is struggling just to do the basics of what newspapers are supposed to do. So we've had to kind of adapt our mission, that what we're really here to do is media criticism, not newspaper criticism necessarily. Market forces. And I've been very critical of the industry itself, and there's plenty of room for criticism. Going back really decades, I think that the consolidation of the industry, the papers that have survived best have been ones that have avoided that consolidation, not joined newspaper chains. A small local paper serving a community can find advertisers and subscribers in a way that Post Media or Black Press, there's all kinds of chains that just don't seem to be able to create the same kind of connection to their communities. The lack of technological innovation, giving it the original sin of just giving it away for free on Facebook. There's so many things the industry did wrong. Had they done everything right, would it be much different? I'm not so sure. So what is hollowing out the newspapers? Technological change. The fact is that the classified section for decades and decades was just a absolutely dependable cash cow for newspapers, and that was taken away. That was the first thing taken away by Craigslist and later Kijiji. And then really, if you wanted to reach a local consumer as an advertiser of any kind, you really had very few options. You had the newspaper, you had local radio, and maybe a local TV station, but the newspapers really had a license to print money for a long time. And there's just a better way to advertise right now. You can target people not just based on their geography, but based on their interests through keyword searches and targeted advertising online. With those things gone, it maybe the writing was on the wall. Now, that being said, I do feel like there has been less and less to read in newspapers, and newspapers were relying on their subscription base less and less, making subscriptions cheaper than ever to get their readership high for advertising purposes. So they made themselves very vulnerable to these market forces. And the news organizations, I'm not just going to say newspapers because a lot of the newer news organizations don't have physical printed copies. Subscription, everything old is new again. Subscription is now a much more dependable way forward. It's the biggest revenue source for Canadaland. We do advertising as well, but paid subscription is our number one revenue source. So your ability to get people to open up their wallets and give you money is going to be about the content. And if you have been, even when papers were incredibly profitable, they were diminishing their newsrooms. They were laying off reporters. There was just less to read in the papers in the last 3 decades than readers were used to before that. So it left newspapers in a particularly bad position to deal with these challenges. But again, I'm not sure that if you had done everything right, it ultimately would be enough. I'm no expert on that period of history, but I'll tell you this. We can sometimes breeze past the use of the word "the independent" in looking at the history of newspapers. This notion of independence and declaring yourself the independent, what was that about? What did that mean? My understanding is that that was a declaration of independence from what newspapers had been previously in sort of the age of pamphleteering and yellow journalism. That with the advent of the printing press and industrialization, making that something that you could cheaply print stuff on a daily basis, the first application of that was propaganda. And as the practice evolved, the business model went from merely taking a loss on the actual publication of this stuff because the point was to propagate a specific political interest of a party or a special interest, and instead to serve the public. And you needed to promise to your reader, we are independent. We are not being paid to take a loss so that we can sway you to voting one way or supporting this or supporting that or hating this or hating that or hating some people or another. This is here for you. We represent you. And everything that the press became at its best in the century that followed, as the triumphs of the press, it's never perfect, but was about holding power to account and representing citizens in their right to know and their right to good government and their right to be free from corruption from government and from corporations, came from refining that independence and serving the reader above anything else. I do see a corollary in what's happening now. I think that the same spirit that led people to starting independent publications 100 years ago or more is leading a new generation of people who are trying to save the best parts of journalism. We are trying to create something new here and forge a direct relationship with people who need information and who need representation. We are blowing into a hurricane because there is also a new era of pamphleteering. And it is automated. It is machine-based. It is coming from political actors who are reminiscent of the pamphleteers of a century ago, but it's also coming from foreign states. It's coming from bad actors who are simply trying to turn a buck by making people very angry and pushing people's buttons and setting us against our neighbors on the issues that matter most to us. So we're dealing with automated misinformation and disinformation and angry-making, cynical political messaging. Politicians are making their own documentaries. They're making their own news reports. And the true independents who are starting these tiny little news organizations to try to give people trusted information that comes through the practice of doing journalism, we are tiny players in the overall information scene right now. The news business is a strange business. Uncovering a scandal can put you on the map and gain the trust of readers at the same time that it alienates the people who might be providing capital to you. Invariably, you are going to run afoul of the establishment if you're doing the job well. And you want to be in a position where you are not beholden or dependent on that establishment. You ideally draw upon your own readership for the revenue. And that's the model that's been lost. You know, there was an earlier age where you might need backers to start a newspaper, but newspapers were a really good business if you could get it right. And it really was a public trust. It was a contract between journalists, publishers, and readers. And that's been broken. The job of trying to find a way to recreate that is the task at hand right now. Well, my understanding of Pulitzer is he was very much of his time, that we think of him now through the Pulitzer Prize and embodying a name synonymous with the highest principles of journalism. But he was a newspaper warrior in the newspaper wars at a time when there was quite a bit of sensationalism and, at a time when papers were battling each other. And my understanding of the prize is that was itself a bit of a rebranding of what the name had meant prior to that. But I think that this industry has always been about balancing interests, and we've always had, because why does Elon Musk want to own Twitter even though he took a huge multi-billion-dollar bath on it? the wealthy have always wanted to own the media, not necessarily to turn a buck on it. They've wanted to own the media because everybody really cares what people think about them. And the idea that some ink-stained journalist making, a tradesperson's living has the power to really wound the reputation of a wealthy industrial baron has always irked those elites. And so owning the press themselves has always seemed like a good option. I was working in the media as a documentary maker, as a CBC radio host, as a freelancer for about 15 years, covering things like technology. I reached a point where I was looking for a new area to focus on. I kind of get restless every few years. And I was watching The Daily Show, this great satire of cable news that Jon Stewart was hosting at the time. And I was reading New York Times columnist David Carr, who wrote a terrific media column. And I was listening to NPR's On the Media, which did a very journalistic look at journalism. And then I was reading Gawker, which was these sort of snotty, snarky media kids taking shots at their betters in the New York media scene. There were all these different ways in which the American media was willing to look at itself through journalism or through satire. And there was nothing like that here in Canada. I thought, why not? Like every journalist I knew, there were stories that we told each other after work over beers about something that happened that shouldn't have happened, a publisher spiking a story, somebody getting fired for having the wrong opinion. These stories happened all the time. No one ever talked about them. Plagiarism. I pitched different versions of Canadaland. I pitched it as a newspaper column. I pitched it as a television series. And I would always hit a wall at a certain point where people would tell me, well, the newsreader doesn't want to hear how the sausage gets made. And I just didn't believe it. I thought that people really do have an interest in this. I'm certainly interested in it, and I just sort of gambled that other people are too. And at a certain point, the idea stuck with me to the level that I couldn't let it go. And so even though I had, hosted radio shows and podcasting seemed like an amateur's profession at the time, there was no podcasting industry. It seemed like a demotion, a step down to be doing this independently and self-publishing. I swallowed my pride and I did it anyhow. And I thought that Canadaland was the original goal of it was simply to have these candid conversations. Within a few months, people started bringing news stories to me. I had never been an investigative reporter before, but people started to bring me stories not about gossip or newsroom tales, but about things that were happening that shouldn't have been happening. Peter Mansbridge, who was the biggest journalist at the CBC, their chief correspondent and the anchor of their nightly news, was accepting large checks from the oil industry to speak at their events, while simultaneously going on the air and hosting debates and conversations and reporting news stories about that same oil industry without disclosing this pretty apparent conflict of interest. That was the first big news story that Canadaland broke. And what I learned is you can get on a hot streak. Once you have a scoop, people bring you more scoops because they see people don't have a long list in their minds of journalists who are doing this kind of work. So anyhow, we found ourselves and starting to build a team at this point, sorting through all kinds of tips and documents and whistleblowers, and led to a big story also about a CBC host, Jian Ghomeshi, who was accused by dozens of women of non-consensual sexual violence in a story that came out years before the whole Me Too movement became a viral phenomenon in the States. That was just a gargantuan story that I reported in collaboration with the Toronto Star and then carried through onto Canadaland, all the while building a newsroom, building a team, leading to other stories, a large investigation of We Charity that became a scandal that was on the front pages of newspapers every day for a full summer. And I think the finance minister lost his job as a result of that. And we've just been doing this kind of work ever since and expanding into other types of shows as well, covering Canadian politics and different kinds of news. Sure. As Canadaland has evolved and grown, and as we've built this paying subscription base, it's sort of the mission has grown, and this has been happening during a time of media collapse. So what our audience, our subscribers, want us to do increasingly is just fill the gaps, fill the holes. If we received all these tips from this town of Thunder Bay, Ontario, that things were happening there that should not be happening and that no one was looking at. So it sort of becomes, this looks like a job for Canadaland. It wasn't a media criticism story, but it was a story where journalism really had a job to do that nobody was doing. When it came to moving into French language programming, we realized that the two solitudes persist, and there's this entire other world of media in Quebec. And it began with us trying to bridge that gap and speak between the two solitudes by having the wonderful journalist Emily Nicolas come onto our English shows and kind of translate what are people talking about in Quebec right now. But then that led to her hosting a show that does in French Canada what we do in English Canada, which is look at what is happening this week in the news and in the media and talk about it, have a conversation, analyze it. So we are always looking for stories, and the kind of way that we decide, is this a Canadaland story, is anyone else going to look at this if we don't? And if it's something that we're pretty sure is going to go ignored, then that makes a pretty strong case that it's something that we're going to dig into. I think you're muted. There's a real dichotomy in terms of the optimism and pessimism that I think exists for young people. On the one hand, everything you heard is true. The industry is in terrible shape. Jobs are scarce. Young people have a terrible time getting their foot in the door. They are competing with each other vigorously for a dwindling number of opportunities. And even if you win these contests, these musical chair contests, where dozens of talented young aspiring journalists might be competing for one internship, the old rules don't apply. The internship does not necessarily lead to a job. These are newsrooms where people who have been there for years are losing their jobs. There's no room. There's no money for those jobs. So, all of the bad stuff is true, and there's lots of reasons for parents to discourage their children from wanting to be reporters. At the same time, people still wake up every morning wanting to know what is happening in the world. And because there are fewer reporters doing this work than ever before, there are so many stories going uncovered. There are scandals. There are things you can piece together at home just over the internet. And you will be the first person to reveal them if you put the time in, if you have those skills. So it's more fertile than ever before. It's easier to put your name on the map if you can actually, it's a return to the first principles of news in a way. It's sort of open for anybody to go and investigate a news story, to go and look into something and find something happening that shouldn't be happening and then tell the world about it. And I've seen it happen again and again. You can come from nowhere on some of these social media platforms, and if you have true information that you can back up with facts, you can have thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people following you in a course of hours. That's like a magic power for an aspiring journalist. You can make a name for yourself very quickly if you do this work well and find one of the many stories that are kind of hiding in plain sight. So when I am asked to give advice to young people, when people are foolish enough to ask me to give advice, my advice is don't bang your head against the wall trying to break into an industry that barely exists. Just practice journalism. Just start doing the work. And maybe you'll have to find a job in an unrelated industry, or maybe it's while you're doing that internship if you were lucky enough to get one. But don't let anyone stop you from just doing the work. I do think of journalism as, yes, I wouldn't call it a profession. It's more of a trade. It's a practice. It's a discipline. Hopefully it's a career. Hopefully it continues to be an industry. But no matter what, it's a practice that anybody can do. And I think it's a human right, the ability to document what you see and tell the world about it, and hopefully check to find out if it's true and be fair and analyze what you're seeing. Those are just aspects of free expression and free speech. Anyone can practice journalism, and people should. Okay. I'm okay for the moment. I was told we'd be going till 12:45. Does that still work for you? Great. It's been incredibly difficult, well-documented resistance to women in newsrooms. And 1905, I can't imagine the kind of resistance that a woman would meet trying to do this kind of work, trying to do investigative work. We saw a lot of progress in more recent decades, still not to the point of true equality or equity. And now I think the fight for equality in newsrooms has moved on, as it should, or at least grown to include diversity of all kinds of different people who are deserving of representation in newsrooms. And we know that there are real consequences when the news, which is about everybody, is only written by one kind of person. And as much as we strive for objectivity or fairness, people bring their own baggage and their own identity and experience into it. And what we have determined here is that it's not about ticking off boxes. It's not about trying to perform that you're a gender balanced or very diverse newsroom. You are a better newsroom if you have people who bring different experiences from different perspectives. They know things that you don't know. They can speak from a perspective. They understand context. They have connections that you don't have. So in a country like Canada, so many different kinds of people live here, I think it's a necessity to have lots of different people reporting the news as well. Americans are ever present, loom large in any kind of conversation about Canadian media or Canadian journalism. The fact of the matter is that most Canadians would prefer to consume American media than Canadian media. So it's a tough business everywhere. But we're not only competing with each other here in Canada in the Canadian media, but we're competing over a minority piece of the pie with each other, because most of people's attention, and sadly, a lot of their subscription dollar might be going to the New York Times, not to their local news. Ultimately, whether or not we have Canadian news journalism is going to be up to Canadian people. There need to be more options on the menu. There need to be more small independent shops offering people the opportunity to support local media. Too many communities don't even have that option. But where that option exists, people need to take it. They need to support the Canadalands and the Halifax Examiners and the Kukwes and the Public Record in Hamilton and the Sprawl in Calgary. There are dozens and dozens of small independent, local, and subject matter specific independent news sources that people can support if they want to, and they're only going to be around. Like, we're all working on a shoestring, and there's not a lot of capital or investment. Gone are the days when billionaires were putting money into things like this. So we're only going to be here if people decide to keep us around. What I've noticed in a decade of covering the Canadian news media is that information, when it disappears, it creates a vacuum. When that need that people have when they wake up in the morning to just know what's going on, when the news organization, the newspaper that was there filling that need disappears, something will take up that space very quickly. And I would love to tell you that it's always a scrappy young independent digital news site, but more often than not, it's something else entirely. It might be a politician who is producing stuff that looks like news content. It might be a corporate special interest that's doing some sort of branded content. It might be a grassroots Facebook community page, which sometimes get taken over by the loudest and angriest voices and conspiracy theorists and things like that. Sometimes you don't know who it is. Sometimes information just pops up. We did an expose on a YouTube channel that became very popular doing anti-government videos about the Canadian government, and we traced it back to a business in Cairo. So the fact that people will click on information about their world, about their society, about their town, creates all kinds of opportunities for bad actors to just spew out nonsense or to manipulate people. And so we really need to educate people on what journalism is and what it looks like in this day and age as media is changing so rapidly. And we need to give them that option because, yeah, there certainly are wealthy interests in America that have flexed their muscle in Canada and are quite happy to get the clicks or get the buy-in, sometimes towards political ends, sometimes just directly financial. But there's always somebody who will take up that space if it's not filled with journalism. So my understanding of how the hedge funds or vulture funds are affecting the media in Canada and elsewhere is that these are highly profit-motivated and quick profit-motivated ventures that are expert at stripping the meat off the bone. They buy distressed assets. They find companies that are failing, but which still have revenue every year. And they say, okay, this is a business that still has a machine. The machine is slowly dying, but the machine does create income every year. And of course, if your income is greater than your expenses, there's a profit to be made. So they snatch up these dying newspapers. Often these newspapers have considerable assets. They often own real estate, and they have money coming in from advertisements and from subscribers. And then they start cutting and cutting and cutting, and they could not care less about the journalistic product. It is a race to the bottom. Basically, they're selling off the furniture, and when the furniture is gone, they start stripping the copper wiring from the walls. And they will leave each newspaper, they charge, often it takes the form of a usurious loan. In the case of Post Media, they are servicing their debt with government subsidies and paying large bonuses to their executives as they remove reporters from their jobs again and again and again. This is not a path towards a sustainable or healthy media. They will keep picking away at the flesh until there's nothing left. As I recall, there was the Kent Commission into newspapers in Canada some time ago, and I think one of their strongest recommendations was to not allow the consolidation of newspapers to continue. They saw the writing on the wall. This was going to be disastrous. It was allowed to happen anyhow. Even recently, we had the Competition Bureau raid the offices of Torstar and Post Media. They violated, I think, anybody's understanding of what antitrust exists for when they traded newspapers and then basically killed newspapers in any community where both companies were operating a newspaper. And overnight, media concentration multiplied in Canada. These big chains, they made sense for their owners at a certain point in time. At a certain point in time, the economies of scale were such, and the ability to get national ad dollars, and the popularization of wire services, and the ability to produce less of your content locally and instead just sort of centralize things. It meant that papers who are already enjoying double-digit profit margins every year could move that profit margin, expand it even more so. I don't think they realized at the time that they were baking in the demise of all those community newspapers, because when those dependable ad dollars dried up, the subscriber no longer had an attachment to those newspapers. And so they lost the advertisers and they lost the subscribers. And, there's books written about the many years of media barons battling it out and consolidation and chains being purchased by other chains. It all led in one direction, which is multiple chains, became fewer and fewer until you just had a couple, and I don't really see a future for them even anymore. Oh, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you about this stuff.